Welcome everyone to this WCA educational webinar, the 2020 election, what the November results mean for the upcoming legislative session. Our speakers today include National Association of Counties Director of Government Affairs, Mark Ritacco, WCA Director of Government Affairs, Kyle Christianson, and WCA Government Affairs Associate Daniel Bahr. As a reminder, you can type any questions in the chat or the Q&A below. If you have called in, you can hit *9 and Anne-Marie will unmute you. We will take questions at the very end, so feel free to type them throughout the presentations. And with that, Mark, I will hand it over to you, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Again, my name is Mark Ritacco. I'm Director of Government Affairs at the National Association of Counties in Washington, D.C. It's an honor to be with you all today and a pleasure to see some familiar faces. So I want to go through an analysis of the 2020 elections, which at this point is one you've probably seen either on the news or you've read yourself. So, what feels like several months, but has only been about 5 weeks since the election. I think it's worth recapping what occurred in November, but I also want to talk about what is happening in Washington right now as it relates to counties' role in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic very briefly. And as you'll see from this presentation, it's clear that we are a nation divided. Wisconsin is certainly a state divided in terms of voting behavior. But one of the roles of NACo and the National Association of County and State Associations of Counties across the country is to really emphasize that the delivery of services on the county level are nonpartisan or bipartisan. Certainly in my day-to-day, partisanship is not something that comes up very often. I often don't even know whether we're dealing with Democrats or Republicans. So you're about to see a lot of slides that talk about division and partisanship, but I think it would be worth noting that from NACo's perspective, we certainly hope that we can bridge the partisan divide in delivery of services to counties. So let me begin with just a quick analysis of the election itself. As you can see here, and again, you all know, and I made this presentation a couple of weeks ago. So since then, some races have been called, but the overall results are the same, is that the presidency flipped from President Donald Trump to Vice President Joe Biden, and he is now the president-elect. So that is certainly obviously a flip. The Senate is still undecided. As you all know, there's 2 runoffs in Georgia that will take place on January 5th, and that will decide the ultimate control of the United States Senate, as if both Democrats win in Georgia, the Senate would be a 50-50 tie, and the tie-breaking vote in the Senate is cast by the Vice President of the United States, which would be Kamala Harris. The House maintains, so I guess I should say that the most likely outcome of that is either Republicans will win both of those runoffs, or one Democrat will win, one Democrat will lose, and in which case Republicans will maintain control of the Senate. In the House, Democrats maintain control of the House, although Democrats lost seats, and so therefore the majority that the Democrats now have is smaller. And when I talk briefly about what that means for additional stimulus talks and COVID relief negotiations, that smaller majority will certainly come into play. So again, in summary, the nation's divided. Our values are divided, where a certain set of values gravitate to one party and a certain set of values gravitate to another party. But at the same time, we had record turnout, and we had record turnout, obviously, amid a pandemic. Wisconsin had both a contested primary, and a hotly contested general election. So despite the challenges, Americans are willing to participate in their democracy like never before. And the extra layer of complexity this year, of course, for counties was the tremendous amount of mail-in ballots. Each state administered mail-in ballots a different way, and that was a source for political division as well in terms of what people thought of mail-in ballots. And the results of this election, from the presidency to the Senate, House, and on and down to local races, it's clear that there are millions of Americans who voted for Donald Trump and a Democratic senator, or voted for Joe Biden and a Democratic House member, or any combination of those things. So in some ways, Americans chose a divided government, and you have to understand what that means in terms of where the electorate is at. All that being said, trying to put a positive spin on our division is really not what I'm here to do. In fact, this division can be corrosive in many ways. So the next few slides are about how deep that division really is. So as you see on your screen, 85% of US adults said Biden and Trump supporters disagree not only over plans and policies, but also over basic facts. And this is certainly a corrosive aspect of any democracy, of any government. I mean, you can certainly imagine at the county level, if we had, and maybe you all have dealt with this, but a basic agreement on facts is critical to a functioning government, especially on the local level. So this idea that we can't agree on reality is problematic, and then that bleeds over to sort of core values and fundamental values. So if one side says, it should be the ideal of America to do X, and the other side doesn't think that, you'll never agree, of course. So I think what this division, one of the hallmarks of it is that the end goals are different, whereas in years past, perhaps the end goals weren't different, which is, a sample end goal might have been, we want the least unemployed people, or we want the highest GDP, or whatever it might be. But we're getting to a point where we can't even agree on that end goal. I'm not going to go through everything on the screen here, and I'll certainly send this presentation afterwards. I want to be mindful of everybody's time and certainly our other speakers. But not only are we sort of divided along party lines, that division is indicative of who you are and how old you are, and your cultural and racial makeup of your community, and certainly of your identity. So again, I don't want to just read slides to you, and I will make sure I send this, but sort of a key thing to think about in trying to understand the election is, why people would have voted for Joe Biden and why people would have voted for Trump. And there's, endless media speculation about that. I think for Democrats, or people who voted for Joe Biden, I should say, COVID-19 is a really important aspect of their lives every single day. Certainly is for me. I have 2 young kids who are not in school. Or were I someone who couldn't work from home? Obviously, we're all fortunate to be able to telework, but that is not the case for everybody. So if you looked around and saw a disappointing performance on COVID-19, that would trend you towards Joe Biden, who, for better or for worse, I think we can expect a sort of less showman-like approach to the presidency relative to Donald Trump, and then certainly progressive people, given the 2 choices between Trump and Biden, would have chose Joe Biden. On the other hand, lots of people voted for President Trump, an historic amount, in fact, just certainly not enough to win. And for those people, based on polling and intuition, the economy is very important. And all the things that led President Trump to victory in 2016 still exist, such as the hollowing out of the middle class, whether that's China to blame or globalization or American companies outsourcing. Obviously, very important to folks in Wisconsin. Fear of being left behind in the new economy, anger with political correctness, concerns about socialism, and again, a lot of the themes that propelled President Trump to win in the first place. Not listed here, of course, is a business-like approach to governing, and again, all of President Trump's strengths. So, a divided nation has again divided ideals about their candidate. This is again talking about historic turnout. As you can see, there are more people, so there are more people voting. But even adjusting for that, this year was historic turnout. In this map, when you see this slide and have some time to digest it, it would be really interesting to see where voters are swinging one way or the other. I mean, you can certainly look at places like the Deep South. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Maybe you can now. The Deep South and places out west certainly are trending more Democratic, and then obviously along the center of the country here, for lack of a better term to encompass all of these states, heavy swings towards Republicans. A lot of the controversy about the election is about the historic and atypical way which votes were counted this year. And depending on how votes were cast, they showed a certain candidate up or down. And in fact, the election was a lot less close than the sort of news media made it seem for the successive few days after the election. I mean, the election was in fact not close. Joe Biden won by almost 2 percentage points, comfortable margin in the Electoral College, but because of the mail-in ballots, that there was sort of almost a illusory sense of closeness, and this slide talks about that. Certainly an urban-rural divide, which again I would encourage you all to dig into more. It's obvious, it's intuitive where that divide occurs, but looking at some key states, Wisconsin being one of them, you can see how razor close. Again, I'll try to get my cursor on the screen. You can see how razor close this is. So a 2 percentage flip here is the difference between a red state and a blue state. Just recapping the presidential race, just a final note on it. The outcome of the election mattered to people. So it's clear through exit polling and other polling that and it may seem obvious to say, but people went to the voting booth attempting to get an outcome instead of, for instance, to say, this is what might be best for me and my family. This is what's my personal belief. They wanted an outcome. And again, as I said, for millions of people, that outcome was a divided government. But all in all, this presidential race was a referendum on President Trump, certainly as it would be a referendum on any sitting president. And clearly voters had the intention to replace him with Vice President Biden. So let me just talk about the shifting to the Senate. I'm not going to only spend a minute here on the House. The House, as I said, House Democrats narrowed their majority, and looking ahead to 2022. If history is any indication, the party in power generally loses seats, and the amount of seats that Democrats have to lose in order to keep their majority is very thin. And that is also one of the reasons that you see very few House members and possibly none, although Cedric Richmond comes to mind. But you will see that not many House members will join the administration, because in the case in the case that a House member leaves to join the administration or for any other reason, there's a special election to replace that House member. And given the uncertainty and the razor-thin margins, you certainly wouldn't want to leave that to chance if you were the Democratic majority, for fear that you would lose another seat. In the Senate, it's a bit different. As you all know, the governor appoints a replacement senator, and so therefore there's a little less harm or fear or uncertainty about a senator leaving the Senate to join the cabinet, because their governor would replace them. So in states where there's a Democratic governor and a Democratic senator, there's no fear of losing that seat. And speaking of the Senate, just quickly recapping what occurred, and a note about replacement. Obviously, Senator Harris is leaving the Senate, but she'll be replaced almost with certainty by a by a Democrat, because the governor of California is a Democrat. But as you see here, hopefully you can see in the yellow highlight, essentially Republican senators overperformed the predictions. You know, you had several toss-up senators here, and most of them ended up winning. You can see here the toss-up senators, and you might dispute whether any of these were truly toss-ups or not. Iowa maybe wasn't a toss-up, but Maine certainly was. North Carolina certainly was, and South Carolina was, perhaps to some extent. But if the results are any indication, that race wasn't as close as it seemed. But you know, for instance, Maine, a true toss-up state, went to Republican. So very fair and accurate to say that the toss-up Republicans sort of overperformed expectations. And therefore, that led to the likely outcome of all of this, which is that Republicans will maintain control of the Senate. And here is a recap of what all happened. So the two states that flipped from Republican to Democrat are Arizona. Mark Kelly won the seat, and Colorado, John Hickenlooper, who was a former governor of Colorado, beat Cory Gardner to retake that seat. But as you can see, the rest of the seats, Republicans won. So looking ahead, you'll hear a lot about the Senate map. As you all know, only 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years, and in 2022, more Republicans are up than Democrats. So by map alone, that would seem to favor Democrats. But as you can see here, only 3 Democrats remain in red states. And as is typical, the president's party loses seats in the midterm election. The last time that did not occur was, I believe, in 2002, in George W. Bush's first midterm. There was sort of, we were still in the wake of 9/11, and the Iraq War was a major motivator for people, or the prospects of it. So Republicans actually, I believe, gained seats in that particular election. So it's been a while. Again, looking at the clock, would definitely encourage you to dive into these slides. I'll save you all the analysis of the state legislatures, but really interesting stuff. As you can see here, fewest legislative chamber switches since 1946. And there are several reasons for that. And then trifecta control of state government. Heading into 2020, Republicans controlled 21 states, 15 for Democrats, and 14 were split. After the 2020 elections, Republicans added Montana and New Hampshire to control, trifecta control, which is, the House, Senate, and the governorship. And only 12 states are now divided, which is some combination of split control between Republican governor and Democratic state house, so on and so forth. State legislatures, as you know, are incredibly important to redistricting, and these gains in state legislatures will certainly help Republicans during redistricting. Okay, so again, we'll send these around. Encourage you to dive into those data points that I didn't get to. I just wanted to quickly pivot, if I can, Dan and others, Kyle, if that's all right, if have a couple more minutes, just to talk about a topic that I feel a lot more comfortable discussing, which is, again, the nonpartisan nature of our role as counties and how we can help our residents. Just want to put a plug for the resources that NACo has on our website to help you. We have a full team of people churning out reports that could help you understand everything from broadband to WOTUS to the Medicaid inmate exclusion policy, transportation infrastructure, and PILT, just to name a few of our key priorities. And so I would certainly encourage you to check out NACo.org in order to do that. And then just very briefly, want to highlight what's going on right now. I mean, it would be remiss if I didn't talk about the massive negotiations that are happening right now on an additional round of COVID relief in the United States Congress. And, you know, there's certainly going to be text released today. There's negotiations back and forth. And of course, over the weekend, trying to get a deal that would bring COVID relief to state and local governments and communities through unemployment insurance and stimulus checks and schools and vaccine deployment and all the things that are crucial to keeping our communities safe and prosperous. The message that we're delivering to lawmakers on Capitol Hill is that counties are on the front lines of delivering public health response to COVID-19 and to looking forward to deploying a vaccine. So certainly require additional assistance in order to do that. Folks in Wisconsin, including you all, have been really instrumental in getting that word out to lawmakers in Congress about the urgent need for additional relief. And NACo has joined a coalition with our private sector partners to really hammer that home. And I know that a similar effort is underway in Wisconsin. And we think that that is the most effective way of communicating the urgent need for additional aid for counties of all sizes. I'll say the developments over the weekend make that unlikely, unfortunately. State and local aid or additional assistance to state and locals governments has become partisan. And there are Republicans in the Senate who are adamantly opposed to granting additional aid to counties, states, cities. And so we'll just need to see how that plays out. There's some bipartisan, bicameral movement on that front, but the reality is that Leader McConnell specifically has signaled his opposition to that. But Secretary Mnuchin, who's negotiating COVID relief on behalf of President Trump, is talking with Speaker Pelosi today, who's of course negotiating on behalf of House Democrats. So we're certainly hopeful that they can strike an agreement that delivers additional state and local aid because it is so urgently needed. So I'm looking at the clock. It's about my time, but I guess one last slide is that the need for additional funding is so acute because NACo has determined that there's hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue loss and public health expenditure to counties throughout America. And we've done really wide sweeping research on this front to help make the case to Congress to help deliver additional relief. So that is it for me. Happy to take questions now or later. I haven't been looking at the chat. Perhaps there are questions, but one question I anticipate getting at some point is whether Congress will extend the CRF deadline for the previously passed CARES Act, and that is certainly in the mix of possible things that they will do. So I will take that question if it comes later, but I just wanted to note that now before I got that question. So Kyle, happy to kick it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. We really appreciate the federal update. And with that, we'll transition a little bit to kind of more of a state focus. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dan Bahr.
Hey, thanks, Kyle. Thank you, Mark. Great presentation. Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. And we'll start out just talking a little bit more about the election and how it turned out across the country, but here in Wisconsin. And, I would just comment, it was a tale of two outcomes, I'd say. Typically in an election cycle, you'll have a wave and one party will be successful. Like in 2010, Republicans had a very large wave. They took over the governorship, both houses of the legislature, all across the country, picked up the House of Representatives, picked up US Senate seats, things like that. In this case, we didn't quite have a wave one way or the other. There was Democratic success at the top of the ticket with the presidential election, as Mark had pointed out. But down ticket in the Congress, in state legislators across the country, there was a lot of Republican success. He did very well. So we'll start with the presidential results. As Mark had mentioned, Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, will return to Washington, D.C. as the 46th U.S. president. He did garner 306 to 232 electoral votes, won the popular vote. But looking at the state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin was, like we would expect, typical Wisconsin, very, very close. Really, Joe Biden, he won Wisconsin by just about 20,000 votes, which is similar to the result we saw in the state of Wisconsin in 2016 when Donald Trump also won Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes. That also mirrors our gubernatorial race back in 2018 when Tony Evers won the state by just over 1%, by about 30,000 votes. We also had a recent Supreme Court election with the Justice Brian Hagedorn prevailing over a liberal challenger, and he won by just over 5,000 votes. So Wisconsin, as always, was very, very close. The presidential race here was very, very close. The state's very divided, maybe even more so than the country. And it's sort of the tale of the presidential race. But some Democratic success was that Joe Biden did quite well. He did win the Electoral College and the popular vote. And so if we could advance the slides, if possible. Yep, so it talks about Wisconsin, and here's a look at some of the maps. The counties in Wisconsin, obviously rural areas going pretty red. You see some of the blue areas. The deepest blue county there is Dane County in the south central part of the state. You have in the west to La Crosse and Eau Claire County going blue, Stevens Point in the middle, Superior, that's Bayfield and Ashland County in the north, and Douglas County, they also went blue. Those are traditionally Democratic areas, but they have been trending more Republican as in recent years. Also Milwaukee County went blue. The rest of the state was red, even the Fox Valley, Green Bay, Appleton area, Oshkosh, slightly going red this past year. That's been consistent through time, so not much change up there. But that's sort of how Wisconsin went, and the electoral map fairly similar, except Georgia uniquely went for the Democrats. President Trump did not perform as well as traditional Republican candidates in the Atlanta suburbs. So essentially, though, the map pretty much the same as we've seen in years past. And so we'll move ahead and look at what happened here in Wisconsin in terms of Republican down ticket success nationally. Mark covered it pretty well. The Republicans did overperform. Susan Collins, many thought she would be defeated in the state of Maine. She held on, actually won by almost a 10-point margin. Senator Joni Ernst next door in Iowa was considered vulnerable, as was Tom Phillips in North Carolina. Those senators all won re-election quite easily. The GOP is expected to maintain U.S. Senate control. There are two runoff races in Georgia. Republicans slightly favored in those races. Polling is close. Experts, if you read Politico and other news coverage of those races, Republicans have a slight edge, maybe in Georgia, I should say. But we'll see how that all turns out on January 5th, when those two seats will both simultaneously be up on the same day. And so moving on into the U.S. House also, so far, Republicans added 12 seats to their minority. Democrats will maintain a majority. The U.S. House makeup with 2 seats still pending. There's still two seats, one in central New York and another seat that are still have not been called. I believe the other seat's in Iowa, where the Republican has a 6-vote lead. I think the Republican in the central New York seat has a 12-vote lead. Very close races. But right now, with those seats still pending, we have 122 seats for Democrats, 212 for Republicans. In any case, 218 are necessary for a majority. So Democrats already have a majority with 222 seats, 2 seats still pending. And in Wisconsin, each incumbent running for re-election in our congressional delegation won re-election. There were 7 incumbents in the state of Wisconsin who ran for re-election. They all won. The closest race was won by incumbent Congressman Ron Kine in the western part of the state. He won by just over 3 points in an area that's trending a little bit Republican. The only change in the congressional delegation will be the retirement of James E. Sensenbrenner, a longtime congressman in southeastern Wisconsin, and he's going to be replaced by current Wisconsin State Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald. He'll be the new congressman in the 5th congressional district. So that's the only change, pretty much status quo in terms of our congressional representation. And so we can move on then, and also want to emphasize as we talk about the GOP success down ticket, go to the Wisconsin legislative seats so we can go. We talked about the Senate and the House and how well the Republicans did there. But in the Wisconsin legislative elections, we sort of going into the election cycle, had a situation where Republicans had big majorities in both houses of the legislature. And essentially, we're hoping where they could achieve a situation where they'd have what's known as a veto-proof majority, or a 2/3 majority, which would allow them to override the veto of Democrat Tony Evers, our governor. He can currently veto legislation, and Democrats, although they are in minority status, they're able to sustain his vetoes. There's not enough Republican votes. 2/3 is necessary to override the governor's veto. There's not enough votes. So the Republicans had a goal, it was a lofty goal, of establishing veto-proof majorities. Democrats, in response, started an organization, a political action committee known as Save the Veto. That group raised lots of money, trying to increase the size of the Democratic minorities and prevent the Republicans from getting a 2/3 majority. And they need a 2/3 majority to override the governor's veto in both the lower house, the assembly, and the upper house, the state senate. And so that was the goal of the Republicans. And uniquely this election cycle, Republicans, at least at the legislative level, have been sort of notorious for their ability to raise money and do so at a level much more effectively than the Democrats have done. This year, that was different. Democrats raised record sums of money. Wisconsin Democratic Party and the Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee, the Wisconsin State Senate Democratic Campaign Committee, they raised unique amounts of money here in Wisconsin and outraised the Republicans for the first time in a long time. And so they were able to surpass the usual Republican money advantage. So those are some of the unique factors leading into the legislative elections here in the state of Wisconsin. And so how did the election turn out? Well, Republicans went into the election cycle. Before the election, they had a 19-14 majority out of 33 seats. Democrats had a difficult map because Jennifer Schilling and Dave Hansen, 2 incumbent state senators from swing districts, both retired from their positions and did not seek re-election. Both were popular incumbents in their districts. Jen Schilling from the La Crosse area, Dave Hansen from the Green Bay area. And also Democrats were fighting to hold on to the 10th state Senate district seat held by incumbent Patty Schottner. She won a special election in 2018 with high Democratic turnout in that typically Republican leaning seat. It's a seat that's right along the Mississippi River. It borders Minnesota. It's a seat that went heavily for Donald Trump, has voted for Governor Walker. So it was sort of tough sledding up there, but the Democrats were trying to hang on to that seat. Republicans were defending incumbent state senators Pat Testin and Alberta Darling. Alberta Darling has a seat that's been trending more Democrat as of late, as the seats in the North Milwaukee suburbs. Patrick Testin represents a seat in central Wisconsin, including the city of Stevens Point, but many areas around it. I'd say the areas around Stevens Point have been trending more Republican, but those were the 2 Democratic targets, and essentially those are 5 seats: the Darling seat, the Testin seat, the Schottner seat, the seat that was held by Jennifer Schilling, and also the Dave Hansen seat. 5 seats. 3 of those 5 were held by Democrats. Republicans actually won 4 of the 5 competitive seats, and thus they will return in January the Republicans with a 21-12 majority, a very impressive majority. But to get 2/3, you got 33 total seats. To get to a 2/3 majority, you need 22 seats. The Republicans came close, very impressive majority, 21-12, but 1 seat short of a veto-proof majority in the state Senate. So that's what happened in the upper house. And then we'll go to the next slide. In the state assembly, Republicans went into the election cycle with a 63-36 majority out of 99 total seats. So really, out of 99 to get to a 2/3 majority, they would have needed to pick up 3 seats to get to 66. That was the goal, and again, Democrats spent a lot of money to prevent that. But in this election cycle, Democrats had some success. For the first time in a while, they defeated a couple Republican incumbents, both Representative Jim Ott and Representative Rob Hutton were unseated. And the Democrats were able to hold all of their open seats and all of their incumbents. And as a result, it's a net Democratic gain of 2 seats in the lower house and the state assembly. And so the composition of the state assembly will be 61 Republicans and 38 Democrats in 2021. So a significant majority for the Republicans, an impressive majority, but still a number short of the veto-proof majority that they were shooting for, that was their goal. And so as we get into redistricting, which will take place in 2021, as we get into the next state budget cycle, as we get into a lot of different issues that will come up, there will not be GOP supermajorities. They'll have to find compromise with Governor Tony Evers as we go forward. So that's sort of how things shook out here in the state of Wisconsin. So I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Kyle Christianson, and he'll take some time to talk about what these election results, the new makeup of the legislature, divided government prevails again. He'll talk about what that means for us looking forward.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mark, for giving us a pretty comprehensive overview of what happened not only at the national level but also at the state level in regards to the election results in early November. One of the things we've often talked about as an association is that while the association is not partisan, it is clearly political. And what we mean by that is that the association operates in a political environment, and that political environment is often defined by the election results. So that's one of the reasons that we're spending a little bit of time with you this morning to talk about the election results, and now to talk to you about really what those results mean, not only for the state of Wisconsin, but specifically for counties and county government. Even before we get into this slide, one of the things I think that as we've talked about the election, we continue to review the results. One of the big takeaways from the association is that based on this election, it appears that the 2 major political parties in this country and at the state level, the Republicans and the Democrats, seem to have to some degree an identity crisis. And what I mean by that is the historical coalitions that have put either Democrats or Republicans into office. We didn't really see that in this election. And if you look specifically at Wisconsin, you look at Republican strongholds, typically in the southeast of Wisconsin, suburbs, college-educated men and women. Those were typically Republican strongholds. And if you look at the election, they've softened, and they've softened quite a bit. And where Republicans have done better is in rural areas. And you see the kind of the same thing with the Democrats, where in some of the Western Wisconsin seats where Democrats in this state typically did very well, they're now doing, they're underperforming there, but overperforming in the suburbs. So I think one of the interesting things that we'll be talking about over the coming months and years is what is the new identity of each political party, and what is the coalition that ultimately elects those people. And why I think that's important, especially for the association, is not so much because it affects us how these folks are elected, but rather because if new groups of people are now going to one party or the other, that also means that the things that those groups of people care about may be different. So for example, while a large group of the Republican base or Democratic base used to care about issue A, now they may care more about issue B. And that's an analysis that we think is important, and something we'll be looking at very closely, because if the new kind of base of each party cares about different things, there may be opportunities legislatively to advance causes, even with Republicans in the majority, that 2, 4, 6 years ago, they may have been non-starters. It may change now because the base of the electorate has changed for those respective parties. But with that, kind of what is our strategy, going forward? As Dan mentioned, we continue to have divided government, not only at the national level, but also at the state level. we'll continue to have to manage and really maneuver the relationship between the state's chief executive, Governor Tony Evers, and what is still large majorities in the Wisconsin State Legislature for Republicans. It's probably no secret to anybody on this webinar that that relationship between Governor Evers and the Republican-led legislature has not been overly productive. In fact, we went about 6 months in 2020 without the two sides even really talking to each other. But I think we're optimistic that that relationship seems to be improving. To what degree, I think is still uncertain, but there's at least conversation occurring. Just in the last 3 weeks, there have been 3 meetings between the governor and legislative leadership. And again, that's something that we hadn't seen for many months. So we'll have to continue to explore and maneuver that relationship as we head into the 2021 legislative cycle. You know, as Dan mentioned, if you step back and you look at the elections in Wisconsin, you really didn't have any change whatsoever in the political composition of the legislature. Right? Republicans ultimately picked up 2 seats in the Wisconsin State Senate. Democrats picked up 2 seats in the Wisconsin State Assembly. So from a political composition perspective, you still have the same number of Republicans and Democrats. But I think if you really have to drill down from there, though, to really understand what's happening, because while you have the same numbers of Republicans and Democrats, you have a significant change in who those folks are, and especially at leadership levels. And when we look at that, we first look at the Wisconsin State Senate, where current Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald was elected to Congress. So we have entirely new leadership in the state Senate. We have Senator Devin LeMahieu who will be the next Majority Leader. We have Senator Chris Kapenga, who will be the new Senate President. And then we also have a new co-chair of the Joint Committee on Finance in the Senate with Senator, former Representative Howard Markline. So you have, again, the same parties really controlling, but the players are significantly different. So how that relationship is going to work, how those caucus dynamics are going to play out, is something that the Counties Association, along with every other lobbying organization in the state, is going to have to deal with, adjust to, and adapt to. And as I mentioned, we not only have a new co-chair of the Finance Committee and about 4 new members on the Senate side, but the Assembly Finance Committee also changed. We had the retirement of longtime co-chair John Nygren, who had led the Finance Committee for almost 6 terms. Now he's being replaced by Representative Mark Bahr. So not only do we have leadership changes, but we also have significant changes in the state's budget writing committee, which, as we've talked before, is one of the strongest, most powerful legislative committees in the entire country. Anne-Marie, next slide, please. So what does all this mean? First, we have a lot of new members. Again, the political composition didn't necessarily change a lot, but new members, new faces, and what that means is new relationships. So one of the things that we're already starting to do is reach out to new members of the Wisconsin State Legislature, not only introduce us, but introduce our legislative agenda to them. Of course, that's complicated because for the first time in a really long time, we're lobbying in a global pandemic. And what does that mean, and how are we going to operate? I think the jury's still out on that. For example, right now, I'm sitting 300 feet from the Wisconsin State Capitol, and the doors are locked. So how are we going to effectively communicate our message to state lawmakers and the governor's office in this global pandemic? One of our strategies so far has really been to utilize Zoom and telephone calls. That's been at least a short-term strategy. I think it'll be interesting to see over the coming weeks how many in-person and face-to-face meetings we'll ultimately have. But I think, especially given the pandemic and the uncertainty over state resources, one of the critical things for us and other groups to have success is going to be realistic, right? And not only be realistic with your financial asks, again, given the uncertainty of the pandemic and the uncertainty, as Mark mentioned, over the potential for federal stimulus efforts and additional funds to local governments, but also be realistic in our ask in terms of divided government. Typically, we don't see major initiatives or sweeping changes to programs or policies underdivided government that typically occurs when one party controls both the legislature and the governor's office. So we need to be realistic with the things that we're asking for and make sure that there's a reasonable chance of success if we're devoting significant resources to those. And then, as always, and I think this is more important this year, given the pandemic, we need to be proactive. And I can tell you, we were one of the first groups to have meetings with the governor's office and state agency secretaries on our priorities for the upcoming session. We continue to be in touch with the governor's office every 10 to 15 days to follow up on our priorities. So being proactive, while always important, I think is even more important this year, because while in 2 years ago or 4 years ago, governor administrations at this time are typically focused solely on the state budget, we know that there's other things going on with the pandemic that is in some ways distracting from the budget itself. So being proactive and making sure that our asks are not only clear, but well-defined is one of our strategies heading into the upcoming legislative session and the 21-23 state biennial budget. The other thing that we're really leaning on this session or this upcoming session is utilizing our relationships with former county officials. We are fortunate in that we have a number of folks in the Wisconsin State Legislature who have prior county government experience. Now, a number of them have experience in elected office, but others have experience with the county in other ways. So, for example, if we look at the new co-chair of the Assembly Finance Committee, it's Representative Mark Bahr. He's a former Dodge County jailer, has a great understanding of county government. We're going to utilize those relationships and their existing knowledge base of county government to advance the association's priorities come January. And then finally, I think it's very important that once again, we generate grassroots momentum. And what I mean by that is really member engagement. Given that we don't know how many face-to-face interactions we're going to have with members of the legislature, it's more important now than ever that local officials, county officials, whether they're elected, department heads, employees, that they're really assisting the association in driving our legislative agenda. Again, I think face time is going to be limited for really every lobbyist in this state. So the more that we can engage the membership to talking to their respective legislative delegations about the association's priorities, I think ultimately the more successful that will be. So with that, that's a little bit of an overview of kind of the election, where we think things are headed, where we're going from here. And at this point, Michelle, I think we'd be happy to answer any questions for myself, Dan, or Mark.
Thank you, Kyle. At this time, I don't see any questions. As a reminder, you can type it in chat Q&A, and if you called in, hit *9 and we can unmute you.
Michelle, we must have covered everything.
I think you did. You did an excellent job, everybody. If there are no questions and all of our speakers are okay to wrap it up, I think this has been an incredibly beneficial hour. The resources we have available to our membership is really great. And Kyle, if you could make a mention of the CAP team, that would be great at this time.
Hey, Michelle, looks like we just got a question that came in.
Yeah, I did see that. So Kyle, why don't we come back to the CAP team? And our question is, how is the Fair Maps initiative going?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been a lot of discussion about how the state redistricts, especially with, we being on the verge of redistricting year. The reality is that there will be no change to the redistricting process in this state in 2021. What we fully expect to happen is that the legislature, again, controlled by Republicans, will draw maps. In all likelihood, at this point, it appears that Governor Evers will probably veto those maps. Especially if this plays out historically as redistricting is played out in divided government. And then ultimately it'll head to the courts. Right now there's questions about what court ultimately has jurisdiction over this, whether it be the state Supreme Court or federal courts. But the courts are more than likely going to play a not so insignificant role in this process. Whether that means they ultimately redraw the lines, I think it's too early to tell. But to get back to the original question, there's really no chance for any change to redistricting, the process of redistricting, anytime in 2021. And then Michelle, you did ask that we put in a plug for the CAP team. That's our county ambassador program. Again, when I talk about membership engagement, one of the easiest ways for everyone to get engaged is to join our CAP team. That's our lobby team. We hold a few lobby days where we go over a few different legislative issues and then send folks over to the Capitol to lobby. Of course, this year is going to be a little bit different. So our first meeting will be held virtually. But again, we encourage everybody to join that because that's a really effective way to speak with your legislative delegation and really to push WCA's agenda over the upcoming session.
Hey, Kyle, we have one more question, and this is from our friend Alec Knudsen in Milwaukee. And he asked, and you can answer this question, should counties be reaching out to their federal representatives? And how can we help on federal efforts?
Yeah, I actually I'll defer to Mark on that. Nobody's closer to what's happening in Washington, D.C. than NACo's very own Mark. So Mark, why don't you take that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Alec. And I'll say that Alec has been a fantastic partner in this effort with me. So I appreciate that question. And the answer is that I would say twofold. One is that you absolutely should be contacting your federal representatives today because decisions are being made as we speak. And the message for them is that aid to counties and local governments and states is incredibly urgent. So we cannot wait until the Biden administration, and we cannot wait until the spring, because in the same way that hotels and restaurants can't wait, the people on the front lines of this pandemic who will be administering the vaccine certainly can't wait either. And secondly, so urgency. And secondly, there's a false choice happening in Washington right now over a trade for liability reforms. So Republicans largely want liability reforms, and the trade for that is state and local aid, which Republicans have so far not wanted. And so decoupling those two issues would be an ideal situation. I apologize if you can see my son behind me. He's harassing my dog, so it's a full house over here. I feel like that guy who the kid came in the back of the video from a couple years ago, that viral video. But anyway, that's happening. That's Sonny. He's behind me. Sorry about that.
Mark, we've all been there, so no need to apologize.
This is payback for doing this to my mom for years when she was working from home when I was a kid. So here we go.
We do have one more question here. Have there been any discussions about special elections for Senator Fitzgerald and now Representative Nygren's seats?
Yeah, that's a great question. As we mentioned, Senator Fitzgerald was elected to Congress, so we'll have to have an election to fill his vacant Senate seat. And then Representative Nygren, just a few weeks ago, resigned from the Wisconsin State Legislature and will be taking a private sector job. So we'll have a vacancy in his 89th Assembly District as well. I know that discussions have been taking place. No final decision has been made on this, but I do believe it's more likely than not that those elections will coincide with the existing spring election. So we wouldn't have a special election for either of these two seats. That's at least where things stand now, but of course they're always subject to change.
We have one more question here. The deadline has passed for the CAP team, but is it still possible, Kyle, to join?
Yes, that's a great question. It is still possible, and I'd encourage you to do so. Again, the more voices of county government that we have represented at that CAP team, the more effective we'll ultimately be. So yes, if you have not submitted your application yet for the CAP team, please do so, and we will make sure that we get you added.
That is all of the questions that I see. If there's anything else anybody wants to add, if not, we thank you for your time today, and we appreciate everybody being here, and we will see you soon back at another WCA webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark,
everybody.
for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.